In this video, we're going to walk through how to build an end-to-end React application using AWS AppSync as our GraphQL database with Create React App as our React application. What we're going to do here is we're going to create the API, we're going to hook it up to the React app, and we're going to send data to and from our GraphQL API. And then in another video after this, we're going to add user authentication, and we're going to make the user's request only come back for the data that they own. So we're going to add authorization in the second video. But this video is going to be mainly setting up AppSync API and integrating it into your React app. So the first thing you're going to need to do is go to console.aws.amazon.com. And from there, you're going to see AWS services right here where you can search for AWS AppSync. Or you can click in the drop-down menu here and go to Mobile Services and click on AWS AppSync. From here, we're going to create a new API. If you've never been to this page before, it may look a little different, but you should see the Create API button somewhere on your screen, probably at the top right. The type of app we're going to be creating is a recipe application. The recipe application will take in a recipe, and it'll also take in directions and instructions about the recipe, and then we'll kind of render that data out from our app. So the name of this API I'll call Recipe API. And for the schema type, we're going to choose Custom Schema. This is going to let us generate our own schema. If you'd like to see a sample schema in a separate application, you can choose Sample Schema, and you can kind of get an idea of what a schema may look like. So we'll go ahead and click Create. And this screen is going to give us a couple of pieces of information that is pretty important. One of them is the API URL. We'll need this when we configure our client application. And the auth mode. For the auth mode right now, we're set at API key. You can do quite a bit with this configuration, but we're going to be setting up authorization and authentication later with AWS services like Cognito. And we're going to change its auth mode later on to work with a Cognito user pool, which is basically a set of users that you have like set aside for a specific app. But for right now, we're going to leave the auth mode as is. And you can fully build out an application with user authentication and authorization with this auth mode. It's just going to work a little differently than what we're going to look at later. But for now, we're going to just keep it like this, and this should be good to go for a lot of use cases. On the left-hand side, we're going to click on Schema, and here is going to be where we create our basic example schema for this app. And this is going to have a type of recipe. The recipe is going to have an ID, a name. It's going to have an array of directions. And it's going to have ingredients. We're going to go ahead and create a basic query, and we'll call this fetch recipe, take an ID, and it will return a recipe. From this basic schema, we can go ahead and click Save, and after this schema is saved, we'll be able to create our resources based on this schema. To do that, go in the top right corner, click Create Resources. From here, we're going to click Recipe. For the recipe table name, you can either choose the example table name there, or you can change it to be whatever you like. I'll just call it Recipe App Table. You can leave it as is if you'd like. It doesn't really matter. I'll scroll down, and we're going to see the following will be added to your schema, and we get some really great stuff added to our schema. We get a couple of queries, get recipe and list recipes. We also have a couple of mutations, so we can create a new recipe, update an existing recipe, or delete a recipe. We also have subscriptions automatically created for us. One of the more powerful things about AppSync, and really GraphQL in general, is the ability to do real-time data, and we do that with subscriptions. I'll go ahead and click Create. That's going to go ahead and do a couple of things. It's going to add that schema to our schema here in just a moment, but it's also going to create a data source for us. And with AppSync, you can use a couple of different types of data sources out of the box. And we're going to be adding more down the road. But for right now, we have DynamoDB, Elasticsearch, Lambda, and then there's a none data source. And for this tutorial, we're going to be using the DynamoDB data source. So if we click on data sources now, you'll see that we have a table already created for us in DynamoDB. This table is going to be empty right now, but we can go ahead and click on it, click on items, and see our items here in just a moment as we create them. Back to the schema. Our schema has been updated with the new items that we saw generated when we clicked Create Resources. On the right-hand side, you'll see a bunch of different data types. These correlate to our schema, and we'll take a look at what that means in just a moment. But for now, let's try to test out our schema and our data source by doing a mutation. So let's try Create Recipe, and Create Recipe has an input which is going to be another type in and of itself called Create Recipe Input. Create Recipe Input takes in the ID, name, ingredients, and directions. So let's try this out. So we're going to just copy the Create Recipe, and with AWS AppSync, we have a graphical editor built in. So when you click on queries, we can actually just go ahead and add our mutation in our queries here. So I'll say mutation create recipe input, and this is going to take an ID. I'll just hard code an ID for now. It's going to take a name, it's going to take an array of directions, and it's going to also take an array of ingredients. And we'll ask for just the ID back when this is created. So now we can test this mutation out by clicking this button here. Here we'll get if we get a successful response, we'll have the ID come back because we asked for that ID right here. In DynamoDB, we can go to our table, click refresh, and see our new item has been created. Back to the console, we want to now query the database for that recipe. The way we would do that is go to queries, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this fetch recipe because it does the same thing as get recipe. And let's try this get recipe query. To do that, we're going to just go back into the graphical editor, and we'll say query fetch recipe, and fetch recipe is going to take in an ID. So let's see here if there's any other information we need to get. Actually, we're going to use get recipe as opposed to fetch recipe. So let's do get recipe. And we want to return the ID, name, ingredients, and directions. And we may even change the query name to get recipe just to be consistent. I don't think it really matters though. So let's go ahead and choose get recipe. And we see that we have our data is returned with an ID, a name, an array of ingredients, and an array of directions. So our query is working, our mutation is working. Let's add one more recipe so we can look at how to fetch an array. The way we'll do that is we'll change the ID, the name, and the ingredients and the directions. And we'll go ahead and click Create Recipe. Back to our DynamoDB console, we see we have 2 recipes now, so that's great. Let's go to our schema and find this query for listing the array. The query name for that is list recipes, and this returns this recipe connection type, which takes an items array of recipes. So the way we'll query for that is just like this. We'll say query list recipes. We'll say list recipes, items. And here we want to get the ID, name, ingredients, and directions for every recipe we have. Now we can click the list recipes query, and our array is returning as expected. So now that we have our database kind of created and we know that our queries are working, let's look at quickly how this is working on the resolver end. Because when you're building GraphQL applications and you're doing the back-end work, if you've ever done this before, you know that there's a layer in between the request and the database, usually called the resolver. The resolver basically takes the request and maps it into something that is recognizable by the database. And the way we do that in AWS AppSync is through something called mapping templates. So we have our mapping templates and our resolvers actually created automatically for us when we create our basic schema. So let's see what those look like, because if you want to do anything more sophisticated, like in the future when we want to add authorization, we're going to need to update these to only do things like return data for a certain user. So let's look at a basic get recipe maybe mapping template resolver. So the resolver has three parts. We have the data source name we'd like to work with. We have the request mapping template and the response mapping template. The request is what gets sent to the database. The response is what gets returned from the database. So for the request mapping template, the main thing going on is this key. We're basically asking for this item with this ID, and we have an argument that's available to us called context.args.id. So any item that's passed in as an argument is available on this context.args argument within our mapping template. There's quite a bit to the mapping templates. It gets pretty, you can get very, very complicated. If you want to do, you can do a lot of complex stuff here, which is great. You can really do anything that you could possibly think of, really, because you're working with a programming language in and of itself. It's more like a templating language, I guess you'd say, and it's called Velocity Templating Language. If you would like to learn more about how all this stuff works, you can really just Google AWS AppSync, and we'll take a quick look at the docs. We'll go to Resources, we'll go to Developer Guide, and on the left-hand side here, there's Resolver Mapping Template Reference. And here there's different references. There's one just on DynamoDB. There's one on the actual context object. We looked at the args, which is the arguments. There's also source, result, and an identity. Identity is what you would use for things like fine-grained access control and arguments. So arguments and identity are probably the two that you're going to use the most. But there's a lot of information here kind of about what you can do with that. So the result is also an item on the context, and this again is part of the response mapping template. This is the result of the request. So that's kind of how this is working. So the schema is what takes the request, it sends it through the resolver, and the resolver goes to the database and then comes back with the response. So now that we kind of have a general understanding about what's going on here, let's look at how to attach this to a React application. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to first create a new React app, and we're going to do that using create React app. So I'm going to say create React app, and I'll call this React Recipes app. All right, now that we have our app created, we're going to need to install a few dependencies. So let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to add UUID for unique identifiers. We're going to add React Apollo. We're going to be using that for our provider. We'll add AWS AppSync and AWS AppSync React. We'll also need GraphQL tag. and I need to add the word add after yarn. You could also, of course, use npm if you'd like. Go ahead and open up this app. So there's two main parts, again, to creating an AppSync app. The first is the client application, which is what we're looking at here in our React app. The second is the API. We've already created our API. We do need some configuration, though, to kind of hook the two together. To get that configuration, you can just click on the name of the API here. For me, it's Recipe API. Scroll to the bottom, click on Web, and we're going to download this AWS AppSync.js config file. This orange button, we'll just click there. This will give us an object that we can use as our config in just a moment. So in our source directory, I'm going to create a new file called AppSync.js, and I'll just paste the contents of that file here. And we'll be needing that in just a moment. This gives us a few things like our GraphQL endpoint, the region, the authentication type, and the API key of our AppSync API. So now that we have our app created, our dependencies installed, and our config ready to go, let's hook up the client at the root level. And we want to basically do this similar to how you would a Redux app, where you create a provider and you set some high-level configuration so all your components receive the data or can receive the data. Similar also to the React Apollo provider, which we're actually using here. You set this at a very high level. That way your entire application can access it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that at the index.js file. So the thing that we need to do now is create that provider. And we'll do that by importing a couple of things. We're going to import the client from AWS AppSync. We're going to import a component called Rehydrated from AWS AppSync React. And we'll talk about what that does in just a second. We'll import the Apollo provider from AWS Apollo. I'm sorry, from React Apollo. And we'll import our config from AppSync, which is this, again, file here. And then we're going to create a new client using the client that we imported from AWS AppSync. And we'll just call this client. And we'll say new client, passing in some config here. We're going to need a few things. The URL, which is the config.graphql endpoint. We'll need the region, which is the config.region. We're going to need an auth object with a type and an API key. We're going to use the config.authentication type here and the config.api key here. So we have this client created. Now we need to use it. The way we'll do that is we'll create a new component called with provider. This will just be a stateless function that will return the Apollo provider. And I might even call this provider to make it look a little nicer. We're going to now add this rehydrated component. Now what this does is AppSync is something that works offline, and the way that it does that is it works with your local storage in React or on the web, or your async storage on React Native. And when you refresh the app, or if you close or you restart the app, it is going to look and get the most recent version of your data and use that before it goes to the network to get new data. So Rehydrated will wait to render the application until that data is ready. And that way we don't have any errors or anything like that. And then here at the level below rehydrated, we're going to now just use our app. And the provider needs to have a client argument, and we're just going to pass in this client that we created here. And now instead of returning the app, we're just going to return this with provider component. And that's really about it. Now this app component here, we should be able to start interacting with our database. So let's go ahead and run this by running npm start from our command line. Okay, good. So the app is running, no errors, that's good. Let's test this out. So the way we'll do that is we need to set up a couple of new folders. We'll have a folder for queries, a folder for mutations for now. The first thing we'll try to do is create a query. So let's call this list recipes.js. Here we're going to go ahead and create a query that looks very similar to our schema. So we want to do the list recipes where we can just fetch the array, and that takes a recipe connection which has the items array. So it's going to look something really like this. So maybe we could even go ahead and just copy that, and here we'll import GraphQL from GraphQL tag, and then we can just say export default GraphQL. And we can just paste our query here from our dashboard. To test this out, let's go back to our app.js. We're going to import compose and GraphQL from React Apollo. We're also going to go ahead and import the list recipes query from queries/list recipes. Instead of exporting default app, we want to export default. We're not going to use compose yet. Let's go ahead and just say GraphQL. This is going to be a curried component, so we'll pass in the app as the second set of arguments there. The first is going to be the query we would like, and this is list recipes. The second is going to be an object with some config. The first is going to be an options object for us. This is going to be a network policy. I'm sorry, this is going to be fetch policy. We'll set this to cache and network. This is basically saying when the app loads, get the data from the cache, but also fetch from the network and update when that new data comes in if it's different. Also, we'll say we want a props object, which is going to be a function that takes this props as an argument and returns this object here. And any property on this object is going to be returned into this component as this.props. So I'm going to say console.log props, this.props. So here we can say whatever we want. So we want the recipes because we're getting that list recipes. We want that recipes array. The way that will come in, it'll come in on this props object. So we can just say something like props.data.list recipes. If it's there, we're going to say we want the props.data.list recipes.items. If not, we're going to return an empty array. And that's it. We should be able to go ahead and run this and hopefully see some data is returned from our database. Okay, so we're getting the recipes there, but it's empty. So let's see what we're doing wrong. So the list recipes should be lowercase. So refresh, we see that we have the two recipes that we created earlier, and they're there, which is good. If we wanted to kind of render those to our screen, we could do that pretty easily. We could just say something like this.props.recipes.map. And we see our recipes there. Okay, that's great. So what about if we want to add a new recipe? Let's check that out. So we're going to need a form. This is going to be a lot more complicated than just rendering a recipe, because now we're going to need, actual functionality to kind of keep up with all this stuff. So let's go ahead and build it out there. So we're going to go ahead and create some initial state. This is going to have a name for the recipe. We're going to have an ingredient text input. We'll also have a direction text input. We're going to have ingredients array, where we create a new ingredient and we push it to this array. We're going to have a directions array. I think that's it. I'm sorry. No, that's right. Directions and ingredients. Let me make sure that matches up to what we have here. Ingredients and directions. Yeah, that's right. We'll have an onChange text. Well, actually, just an onChange function. This will take a key and a value, and we can just call this .setState key value. This is going to be used to update the name, ingredient, and direction. We'll also have a couple of buttons that will add items to our array. So we'll need an add ingredient. That will say this. We'll go ahead and create a new array off of our existing state. And then we'll say ingredients.push this.state.ingredient. And then we can call this.setState. And we'll set the ingredient to be nothing. And then we'll also maybe say if this.state.ingredient is equal to an empty string, we want to return here so we don't add empty items to our array. I think that looks okay. Let's go ahead and do the same for directions. So we'll say add direction. We'll say if this.state.direction is an empty string, we'll return. So we have the two buttons to add directions and add ingredients. We'll now need a mutation, or actually a mutation to update our GraphQL API. So instead of exporting default the GraphQL higher order component, we're going to use the compose, and this will take in like a bunch of different GraphQL operations. So we're going to do GraphQL list recipes, and then we're going to do GraphQL something else. And this is going to be like create recipe or something like that. So mutations, let's create a new file called create recipe. And this is going to be a little different than the last one that we did, because when we did the query for getting a recipe, for getting a list of recipes, we didn't need any arguments, but here we're going to need arguments. So we have to take that into consideration. So let's go ahead and import GraphQL like we did before. And we'll say export default GraphQL like before as well. But here, instead of just doing the regular query, we're going to need a mutation with arguments. So we'll say mutation create recipe. And we see that we have this create recipe with an input. So we're going to need to do that here as well. So here we're going to be doing something like this. Create recipe with an input with the items, kind of like that. So for the arguments here, we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need an ID. We're going to need a name. We're going to need an ingredients array. And a directions array. And for the create recipe input, we'll just now use those arguments that we have. And we'll just go ahead and return all this stuff. And I think that'll work. Now let's go ahead and try to hook this up to our client app. What we're going to do is we'll go ahead and import create recipe from mutations / create recipe. And we'll now use this create recipe as the type of GraphQL operation. And we're going to need a function to call to add the recipe, to call this mutation. So I'll call this onAdd. And this will be a function that takes in the recipe as an argument. And this is going to call props.mutate. And we do need the props. So let's go back and say props. And then we'll have onAdd, which will take the argument there, call props.mutate. And here we're going to pass in variables. And this is just going to be this recipe. So for now, that's all we're going to do. In a second, we're going to add the optimistic response and the update method, which is going to give us like a real-time UI. So let's go ahead and refresh to make sure nothing broke. It's asking for the key here, so let me just add that. All right. So props, we should see this onAdd function, which is cool. So now let's hook up this state with a form, and then we're going to need an onAdd method. So let's create an add recipe class method that we'll call this.props.onAdd. And this needs to take in the recipe object that we referred to here. So we need to create an object from our state. And we do need to pass in an ID, so I'm going to import UUID v4 from UUID/v4. And we're going to need to destructure the name, ingredients, and directions off of the state. And here we can just pass in all of that stuff. And then we can pass the ID as UUID v4. And then we can call this .set state, and we can just go ahead and set these 3 items back to empty strings. So we clear out the forms. So let's go ahead and create some styling. We'll take an input with a height, a width, a border bottom width. Well, actually, that's not right for web. We'll say border bottom and maybe we'll, yeah, let's see how that looks for now at least. And actually, let's do a margin of 10. So let's do an input. We'll give it a style of styles.input. We'll give it an on change of this dot on change, and this takes the key and the value again. So we need to decide what this is for. We'll just say this is for the recipe name. So the key is going to be name, and the value is going to be event.target.value. So let's just save that, see how that looks. Okay, it's kind of ugly, but not terrible. Maybe for the input we can call border none. See how that looks first. A little better, that's fine for now, since we're not really, well, the font size is super small. I guess for people watching this, let's fix that. Okay, perfect. So that looks good. We'll also need a style for our button. I think that looks fine, so let's do button. All right, so we have our button, and we're going to need the items to be laid out vertically. So let's give this a style of styles.container. Container. We'll let this layout display flex direction should be column. And I guess since we have that going on, I'm not sure if this is a line item or justify content. Okay, so line item center. So that's good for now. We don't really care about the header or anything like that. What we'd like to do is just fill out this form, click add recipe, have the item added to our console or to our DynamoDB console in our table. We'd also later on like to have the optimistic response come through and show up automatically. But for now, let's just worry about getting this functionality working. So we're going to need 3 inputs. One is going to be for the recipe name, one is going to be for the ingredient name, and one is going to be for the direction name. We're going to need a couple of more buttons. We're going to need one to add a direction and one to add an ingredient. So I'll say add ingredient and add direction. And maybe for the button we can add a margin of 10 as well. Spread that out a little bit. And we'll make the width for the inputs 450, and we're done with styling, I think. So let's attach these buttons now. So we have add ingredient. Let's attach this to this add ingredient button. And we have add instruction. Add direction, actually. And then finally we have add recipe. All right, let's test this out. So for the recipe name, I'm going to call this test recipe 1. For the ingredient name, I'll just say ingredient 1. So the input should have cleared out there, but it didn't because we have not set a value on these inputs. So let's set the input values here. So for the recipe name, the value is this.state.name. For the ingredient name, it's this.state.ingredient. And for the direction, it is this.state.direction. And if we'd like to, even we could, maybe map out these items as they get added to the array if you'd like to have a little bit more visual feedback. So the recipe name, again, test recipe 1. Ingredient, whoops. I need to add the onChange values to be correct. Yeah, so the onChange for ingredient name needs to be ingredient, and the onChange for the direction name needs to be direction. Last time, we should hopefully get this working now. Recipe name, I'll say test recipe 1. Ingredient name, I'll say ingredient 1. Direction name, direction 1. And now we're going to click add recipe. So it looks like we have an error. Let's go check our console and our DynamoDB to make sure that wasn't created. Okay, so we have some issue between our variable that's being passed in and kind of our, I guess, our GraphQL schema. So let's take another quick look at our create recipe mutation. Let's go to create recipe. So we have mutation, create recipe, ID, name, ingredients, directions. That looks good. Let's go back to our data here. So we have ID, name, ingredients, and directions. That looks good. One thing we can do is before we call props.mutate, we can log out this recipe. So let's try that. Make sure the data is looking good. So the recipe has a name, an ingredients array, an ID, and a directions array, which all looks good. So it's the variable type mismatch. So that explains a lot. Let's go now to our GraphQL declaration and make sure this is all looking good. So we have a required string. This must be the error here. So when we were calling this directions array, we were saying that every item in the array was required as opposed to just having the array required. So that seems to be our error. So let's try this one more time. So recipe name, test recipe, ingredient 1, direction 1, and add recipe. We go to our DynamoDB table, refresh, and we see that we have now a new item with a automatically generated ID here. We have an ingredients array, directions array with our direction and our ingredient. So that's looking great. We've created a query and a mutation now and kind of hooked it all together. but we didn't see the new data show up here. So for us to get it to show up, we're going to have to refresh and wait a second. Ideally, this stuff would show up automatically, and we can do that pretty easily. What we're going to do is we're going to use something called an optimistic response. And the way we do that is in this create recipe functionality here, we're going to add a couple of new properties. Below variables, we're going to have an optimistic response. This is going to be an object. We're going to say type name. And this is going to be a mutation. And we're going to create a new variable called create recipe that we're going to use in just a moment. And this is going to take in this recipe, and then we also are going to give it a type name of recipe. We're going to have an update function. This is going to update the local cache. So we're going to be storing this new data in our local cache. Before it even goes to our database, we're going to just say we're optimistic about this working. Let's go ahead and just add it, and if it messes up later, we can pull it out. So we'll say update. This is going to be a function, and here we're going to take in a proxy as the first argument. The second argument, we're going to destructure the create recipe item that we just created here off of the data object. And here we're going to now say we want to create a new variable called data. We'll set this equal to proxy.readQuery. We'll pass in the query of list recipes. This is going to now give us the current data that's in return from our list recipes query, which is going to be that array of recipes. Then we're going to say data.listRecipes.items.push. And now we can just push in that new recipe that is available now as this create recipe object. And now we're going to say proxy.write query. And this is going to pass in the query of list recipes and the data. And that's it. We should be able to update. So we have test recipe, avocado toast, and spicy tuna. Let's try this out. The recipe name is, we'll call this test recipe 2. So when we click add recipe, we should see that new data show up automatically. All right, we saw it. For some reason now it's showing up twice. I think I know the issue here. What happened is somehow there's something going on with the API client that we have set up that's calling this update function twice. I think it's a bug. If you do get this functionality, not working the way you would like it, then until it's fixed, what we can just do is we can go into our application logic right here before we call proxy.writeQuery, and we can do a little, we can do like a quick check to see if it's already there. So let's do that. So after we get this data, we're going to check to see if the data is already there. We can say let's go ahead and create a variable const has been added, and we'll set this to false. And then we'll say something like data.listRecipes.map, or I guess we need listRecipes.items.map. And we'll say if item.id is equal to create recipe.id we can say has been added is equal to true. So we're gonna like check the current array, and we're gonna be like, is that item already there? If it is, then it's been added. And then we can say if has been added, return. And we'll set this, of course, to let as opposed to const. So let's test this out one more time. So we'll call this test recipe 3 ingredient. Just pass in the ingredient again. And what we're hoping here is we click add recipe. We see the data added here, but only once. All right, it's there. So we have the optimistic response working. We should be able to refresh here and see that we have test recipe 2 and 3 there. So we have our client working. We have our mutations, our queries, our optimistic response working. The next thing we might want to do is add a subscription. And the subscription is going to be, it's not going to make a ton of sense in this app yet, because right now, we're the only one adding stuff, I guess. So it wouldn't make sense that someone else would be in here adding things and we would be looking at them. But this is something you'll be using for sure for real-time stuff like chat applications and other use cases. So let's just add it, and we'll test it out by opening another browser window and like adding the mutation and then watching the subscription happen on another app. So let's go into our source and create a new directory called subscriptions. And here we'll create a new file called new recipe subscription. And this is going to go after our subscription that was declared anyway already for us. So we have this own create recipe subscription, and that's kind of what we're going to do. That's what we're going to use. So here we'll just go ahead and import GraphQL from GraphQL tag, and we'll say export default. And here we'll just say subscription on create recipe. We'll say on create recipe. We want to get the name, ID, and ingredients, and directions. Okay, and that's it. Now we can create our subscription. And the way we'll do that is we'll go into where we do our list recipes and we'll add the subscription there. First, we need to go ahead and import that here. So we'll just say import new recipe subscription. And below where we just are getting the recipes, we'll add a function called subscribe to new recipes. And this will be a function that has an argument we'll call params. And here we can say props.data.subscribe to more. And this is where we're going to kind of do our configuration for the subscription. We'll specify a document. That's going to be this new recipe subscription that we created just a second ago. And an update query. The update query is going to be how the subscription is handled when it comes in. So it will be a function that returns an object. Here we'll have something called the previous, which is going to be our previous data. And we're going to now get some stuff out of our second argument. And we're going to be looking for this on create recipe subscription here. And we're going to return the previous values that were in the update query. And we're going to say list recipes is now going to be set to something else. We're going to set the type name as recipe connection. And the items that are before, list recipe.items, which was that array. Now we can just go ahead and add this new value, which is on create recipe. And we're going to kind of map over all the items that were in that array before and make sure that there's no duplicate IDs. So we can just say ... previous list recipes.items.map. And then we can say something like, or actually we're going to do filter. We're going to say, I guess we can call this recipe. We're going to say we don't want the recipe IDs to match. So we can say recipe ID does not equal on create recipe.id. All right, and that's it. Recipes subscription should be connected. Looks like I have an error here. This needs to be recipe versus recipes. Looks like I have an undefined. I misspelled GraphQL in my import. All right, so let's refresh. Okay, cool. Looks like no errors. Let's just create something. And just to make sure nothing's broken yet. Okay, cool, nothing's broken. So the way we would really test this out would be to open another browser. So let's open up Safari, give this a spin. All right, so hopefully we can add test recipe 5 here. And, whoa. Looks like we have an error there. I'm not sure what that was. All right, so hopefully we can do the add recipe and then have recipe 5 show up on this left-hand screen. Doesn't look like it's working for some reason, so time to debug. So we don't need to just add this subscribe to new recipes as a prop. We actually have to call it, which is something I completely forgot about. So in component did mount, we're going to need to go to our class and call this function. So component did mount. And we'll say this.props.subscribe to new recipes. Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't know how I forgot about that. All right, so let's try this one more time. Go ahead and refresh. I'm going to add a new recipe, recipe 1. Or, I'll call this test. Recipe 1, ingredient name. Add recipe. All right, we see that the recipe showed up as our subscription. Let's try it over here. Test recipe 2. So I'll click add recipe, and hopefully we should go here and see our data show up. Yeah, so our subscriptions are working. As GraphQL and as AppSync and all these tools are developed, we're really rapidly trying to improve the user experience. So look out for nothing breaking, but API improvements, I guess you'd say, to some of this stuff, because we wrote a fair amount of code right here for this subscription to work. Down the road, we're going to be, doing things to make this easier, this whole process. So, the main parts of GraphQL are, mutations, subscriptions, and queries. So we've done all of that. What we're going to do in the next video is take that a step further, because you see a lot of basic stuff, kind of like what we've done. There's videos out there for it. But what you don't see is how to properly do authentication and authorization. When you have a real application, you want to protect your data, and you want to do that in the correct manner. We're working super hard on building tooling around best practices, and I'm going to be creating resources around those best practices as I have the time to do so. It's all already implemented, like the functionality's there, and there's actually documentation. And if you want to read over some of the stuff I'm going to be covering in the future videos, you go to the docs and you click on security. And this will tell you everything you kind of need to know to get started with correct and proper user authorization with your database tables. But we're going to take this existing application, we're going to add user sign-in, and then we're going to say we only want the user that's signed in to get the data. And we're going to do that with just a few lines of code, actually. The client code, of course, creating the user sign-in is going to be more code. But once the user's signed in, most of our client code can stay the exact same, and most of what's going to be handled as far as the complexity is going to be in our AppSync in our AppSync console, in our resolver. We're going to go into our existing resolver. We're going to say things like, once this request comes in, only retrieve the data for this user, and that's it. And so it's going to be kind of like querying a table and only getting the current user data. It's fairly simple, actually, but it's really powerful, and it's very efficient, like as far as speed and stuff like that. This is kind of the way to go when you're doing this type of stuff. Anyway, so that ends this video. I'm going to link to this repo that we just created, this really basic repo. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments or email me at dabbit3@gmail.com and follow me on Twitter, DABIT3 on Twitter. And thank you for watching, and have a nice day.